Well, hello everyone. Welcome back from the long weekend. It's Tuesday. Thank you for joining us today for the Coastal Inundation Community Practices Spring Webinar. Today's webinar will be focusing on climate vulnerability assessments. My name is Lauren Bissonette, and I'm a Resilience Engagement Specialist supporting NOAA's Office for Coastal Management. Today I'll be facilitating this webinar along with my colleague Katie Hinson from the National Sea Grant Office in Hawaii Sea Grant. Katie, could you give us a wave? Great. During our last call with this community, we asked participants to share topics they would like to engage upon through this community of practice. And climate vulnerability assessments was one of the topics which rose to the top. Since then, we've heard questions about where to start when conducting a climate vulnerability assessment, how to incorporate equity, what resources and tools are available, which ones are the best fit for the scope of the climate vulnerability assessment, or based on financial resources available, and how to message the results to local communities, among many other questions. We hope to start to address some of these questions today and provide regional examples through case studies. Oops. On our agenda today, we will give a brief introduction to the topic of climate vulnerability assessments and share some common terminology. Then you'll hear from 3 regional case studies. We'll first have one from Southern Maine, then move to San Diego, before working our way to Hawaii. After the case studies, we will discuss how to best scope a climate vulnerability assessment to ensure it meets your needs. And then we'll wrap up and share the resources that were presented during this call. In the chat box, I will drop the participant agenda, which includes the bios for today's speakers. We have a great lineup of speakers today, so to help us stay on time, please enter any questions that you have in the chat box, and we'll do our best to answer them throughout the presentation. So before jumping into the case studies, we wanted to discuss some common terminology for climate vulnerability assessments and share what we were thinking about for these terms for the purpose of these webinars. With that, I would like to introduce my colleague Danny Boudreau, who is a Coastal Hazards Resilience Specialist for NOAA's Office for Coastal Management.
Thanks, Lauren. Hi, everyone. So as Lauren said, I'm just going to quickly overview some terminology just so that we all are kind of on the same page as to what we mean when we say vulnerability assessments for the duration of this webinar. So in its simplest form, a climate vulnerability assessment is a way for communities looking to address coastal flooding and severe weather and to help them identify the people and places in harm's way. There's 3 components of a climate vulnerability assessment. You'll often hear the terms exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. So you can advance, Lauren, thanks. So just to kind of quickly overview these 3 terms, exposure is looking at essentially the people, assets, and ecosystems and determining whether they will be adversely affected by hazards. Sensitivity is looking at the degree to which a system, population, or resource is or might be affected by hazards. And adaptive capacity is looking at the ability to adjust to a hazard, take advantage of new opportunities, or cope with change. So one quick analogy that we like to give is kind of imagine you're going to the beach and your exposure, you're going to think of your exposure to the sun, right? Are you sitting in the shade? Are you out on a beach with no shade, right? So that's kind of what exposure is. Your sensitivity might be how likely are you to burn, right? You're as an individual, how sensitive are you to the sun? And then adaptive capacity is looking at kind of, well, did you bring sunscreen? Did you bring an umbrella? Those are kind of the best way to kind of think of them in a very simplistic way. Try not to get too caught up on when as you implement a vulnerability assessment that can become kind of crazy trying to distinguish, what's sensitivity, what's adaptive capacity. The most important thing isn't so much that you know exactly what category you're looking at, just the fact that you need to address all 3 of these components to have a vulnerability assessment. And then next slide. We just want to quickly address risk because often we'll get the question, what's the difference between risk and vulnerability? And so risk is looking at the relationship between probability, how likely is something to happen, and the consequence. What is the consequence of a certain impact? In a very simplistic way, you can think of a lot of vulnerability assessments will often address the consequence component of risk, but not necessarily the probability component. And that varies from vulnerability assessment to vulnerability assessment, but just kind of in general, that's most usually what you'll see when you're looking at kind of vulnerability assessments is they've kind of addressed the consequence piece, but not necessarily the probability piece of it. I'm going to stop there because I don't want to bore everyone with more terminology, but the key takeaway when we want you to kind of think about is how important it is to define these terms early on in the scoping process. Different projects and communities will define them in different ways, and we welcome folks to share in the chat if they've been part of a process or seen these terms defined in different ways. Please share that in the chat because it is variable from project to project, and I'm sure in the case studies that we will are about to be shared with us that we'll probably see some differences in terms of how they define terms or some lessons learned from maybe working with communities around defining terminology. So I will stop there and hand it back to Lauren.
Great, thank you so much, Danny. So again, that was just to get us all centered on the same page before we dive into the most interesting part of this webinar, where we hear about our regional case studies. So I'm handing this over to Katie.
Yeah, so we're going to hear today from a range of case studies across a lot of very different regions that illustrate some of these different nuances and aspects of vulnerability assessments in action. So we're going to have the chance to hear from Maine, San Diego, and Hawaii. And we hope that these case studies will help answer some of the questions that we heard through the process of developing this event. So thinking about aspects of qualitative or quantitative data, conducting vulnerability assessments in-house or by hiring a consultant, questions about what kind of data to include, costs associated. So we have a whole lot of ideas that come up in vulnerability assessments, and we're excited to hear those illustrated through these case studies. So first up, we're going to hear from Jessica Brunaccini, who's a Coastal Community Resilience Extension Associate with Maine Sea Grant. And we're very lucky that Jessica actually joins us in the midst of a transition from working with Maine Sea Grant to working with the Wells National Estuary Research Reserve. And she's going to share with us about work on the Regional Coastal Resilience Plan for Southern Maine. Thank you so much, Jessica.
Thanks, Katie. Let's get my screen sharing going. And does that look good to everybody?
Looks great.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So thanks for the kind introduction. As Katie said, I'm a climate resilience specialist and I work with communities across the coast of Maine. I'm excited to talk with you today about how we assessed vulnerability to coastal hazards for the Climate Ready Coast Southern Maine project. So this project was a collaboration between the Southern Maine Planning and Development Commission, the Wells National Estuarine Research Reserve, Maine Sea Grant, and NOAA's Office of Coastal Management. And our project was funded by the NIFWIF National Coastal Resilience Fund. This was a 2-year project that was focused on developing the state's first regional coastal resilience plan for the 10 southernmost coastal communities in Maine. The goal was to advance coastal resilience actions in southern Maine by developing a plan that addressed regional and municipal needs through coordinated conservation efforts, sound land use planning, tailored yet transferable adaptation policies, and nature-based solutions to coastal hazard impacts. The area covers a 10-municipality region, which includes 381 miles of coastline, more than 38,000 acres of conserved land, 6 state ecological focus areas, as well as critical habitat for fish and wildlife species. So as I said, the project ran for a little over 2 years, and it consisted of 5 major steps. The first was assessing regional resilience planning concerns, priorities, and needs. We then moved on to assessing coastal hazard impacts and vulnerabilities. From there, we worked with some stakeholders in the region to identify key vulnerable areas. After we identified those areas, we developed some site-specific visual renderings of resilience strategies that could work in those areas. And finally, we developed a regional coastal resilience plan. Woven throughout every step of the project was stakeholder engagement. So today I'll be focusing mostly on the work that we did to assess coastal hazard impacts and vulnerabilities, although I will touch on how the vulnerability assessment fits within the larger project, because I think that's one of the things that I really want to emphasize is that it's never a standalone piece that you're doing. It's ultimately part of a much bigger trajectory to understand how we can build resilience. So a quick note about who is involved in the project. We created a working group as well as an advisory committee to help guide all of our work. And here is a breakdown of who is involved. So as you can see, we had municipal representatives as well as folks who worked at the regional and statewide level. So before we conducted the vulnerability assessment, we turned to our community partners to help us identify regional concerns, needs, and priorities. We conducted one-on-one interviews as well as a survey with members of the working group, the advisory committee, and other interested parties. The interviews and surveys asked about participants' top coastal concerns, their past and current efforts to increase coastal resilience, as well as opportunities for further advancing the work. 20 people were interviewed and 60 people responded to the survey. And I'm just going to very briefly show you some of those responses. So the first is the top concerns about the built and the social environment. And I've highlighted here the top 3 concerns, which included transportation infrastructure, emergency access disruption, and increased stormwater. The next slide is about the top concerns about the natural environment impacts from climate change. And so here we see that habitat loss and degradation, salt marsh and wetland health, and coastal and beach erosion rose to the top of our working group's concerns. And finally, these are the top priorities for resilience action. So we asked folks what types of resilience strategies or actions they'd like to see in the next 10 to 30 years. And you can see that the strategies that our working group was most interested in was conservation and restoration of natural resources, pursuing nature-based solutions, as well as directing development away from any at-risk areas. So once we had a good sense of the needs and priorities, we then moved on to assessing vulnerability in the region. And in addition to using the information that we gathered through the surveys and the interviews, we also asked the working group directly what they would like to see in this vulnerability assessment. And we did this during our project kickoff workshop, which was held virtually. So you can see here some of the feedback that we received from the Jamboard responses. We also followed up with a survey to ask for additional input. So guided by the needs of our project community, we developed a vulnerability assessment that included the following 4 categories: coastal hazards, infrastructure, social and economic considerations, and habitat and wildlife. We hired a consulting firm called GEI Consultants to help us develop a vulnerability assessment tool. We used existing secondary data sets. So I just want to emphasize that we did not collect any new data. Most of the data came from Maine state agencies, including the Geological Survey, the Coastal Program, the Department of Transportation, et cetera. And we also used data from FEMA and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So just to give you a sense of what we included in each of these kind of categories, here's the first one, which was coastal hazards. You can see that we included things like sea level rise scenarios for 1.3 and 3.9 feet of sea level rise, which corresponds with some of the trajectories that the state of Maine recommends that municipalities plan for. We also included things like the regulatory floodplains. For the infrastructure category, we included things like tidal road crossings, critical infrastructure, and evacuation routes. For the social and economic components, we included things like social vulnerability, public transit routes, as well as parcels with development potential. So parcels that had not yet been developed that could potentially be preserved and conserved from further development. And then finally, for the habitat and wildlife component, we included things like the current tidal marshes, as well as areas where marsh migration was projected, and significant wildlife habitat. So taking all of that data and information, we created a GIS-based vulnerability assessment mapping tool. It was a significant amount of data and information all housed in one powerful tool. So the screenshot here shows the coastal hazard layer, which includes the FEMA floodplain, the highest astronomical tide, 1.6 and 3.9 feet of sea level. So the coastal hazard layer overlaid with the building footprint and roads layer. And you can see that, the darker kind of orange or yellow the road or the house parcel is, the more kind of vulnerable it is to the sea level rise and coastal hazards. Here you can see current tidal marshes, projected future coastal habitats, and conserved layers. So this one is focused a little bit more on the wildlife and habitat, but importantly, kind of looking at where marshes might migrate and where we might want to continue to preserve land. And then here you can see a comprehensive layer of the wildlife and habitats present in the area. So similar to other GIS tools, mapping tools, when you click on the map, a pop-up box appears with information on what exactly is included in that layer. Once we had a working draft of the vulnerability assessment web mapping tool, we held a 2-hour Zoom meeting with the working group and the advisory committee to share what we had done, to provide them with some hands-on experience in using the tool, and to get their feedback on content and functionality. And you can see here some of the feedback that we received from them on the screen. So we went through each of the comments that we received or the suggestions, and we made a number of modifications to the vulnerability assessment in response to the feedback we received. Although we did not, as you can see on the one on the bottom there, including water quality data in a map, we did not include everything because some of the kind of areas of content that some of the working group members might have wanted to see were outside of the scope of this project. So once the vulnerability assessment was complete, our plan was to help to use the vulnerability mapping tool to help inform the identification of priority vulnerable areas. So just because the vulnerability assessment tool itself was done, the process of identifying vulnerable areas was still going on. What we realized is that we didn't really know how to move from having the vulnerability assessment into working with the working group to identify priority vulnerable areas in the region. With the help of our OCM colleagues, including Danny, who's on the call, we realized that this is a little bit of a black box. And I wanted to touch on this a little bit today because I think it's important to talk about vulnerability assessments, but we also have to think about what do we actually do with them when we have them. So the other thing was that our project team and our working group members also knew that we had to integrate qualitative data and information into our decision-making process as well. So as with many vulnerability assessments that are, in maps, they are based on quantitative geographic information. Quotes like this from one of our working group members reminded us that we needed to expand what we might count as data for decision-making. So the project team, we faced this question of how do we use this vulnerability assessment mapping tool that we created while also engaging the working group's local knowledge and expertise to get where we want to go, which is to have a list of priority vulnerable areas in the region. So thanks to many, many hours of technical assistance from our OCM colleagues, we designed a process for moving through that vulnerability assessment to the identification of high priority vulnerable areas. And that process looked something like this. So as you can see, it involved several touch points with the work group and the advisory council. And as it turned out, it was mostly us as the project team that actually engaged really directly with the vulnerability assessment that we developed. But the work that we did with the tool in the background helped to inform the working group's decision-making process. So this phase of the project culminated in a 5-hour in-person workshop where the working group was able to review and discuss information from the vulnerability assessment while also contextualizing it based on their local knowledge and lived experience. Throughout the workshop, they worked together to identify 15 high-priority vulnerable areas in the region. And after we identified the priority vulnerable areas, we then developed visual renderings of potential resilience strategies that could be used to address the types of vulnerabilities that we knew were present in those areas thanks to the assessment that we had conducted. So just really quickly, I want to share some examples of what these visualizations look like. So here's one example for a priority area in the town of Wells. We have existing conditions on the top kind of right part of the screen, where you can see various flooding and inundation scenarios. And then on the bottom are examples of resilience strategies, such as an elevated roadway, culvert improvements, and a public greenway that could help to address some of those vulnerabilities. In this example from the town of Biddeford, we're visualizing a greenway park, a restored floodplain, and affordable climate resilient housing, which helps to address some of the socioeconomic dimensions of vulnerability that we identified through the assessment. And then finally, in this example, we are highlighting what a managed retreat strategy could look like. So as a reminder, this project was really focused on identifying nature-based solutions, and managed retreat strategies or community-led relocation can be kind of considered the ultimate nature-based solution because they move people, property, and infrastructure out of harm's way and return or restore the land to natural habitat. So the final step in our project was to take all of the work that we'd done together with the working group and the advisory committee and create a regional coastal resilience plan that is easy to use and sets the participating towns up for making progress towards their goals. So we launched the plan in November of last year. It took the form of a story map. It is designed for implementation because it has the ingredients, quote unquote, for project scoping and grant proposal development. So included in the plan is the vulnerability assessment web mapping tool, as well as detailed information about each of the priority vulnerable areas that we identified. We also developed a resilience strategy matrix to support decision-making. And because we knew that funding was a key need, we created a database of funding opportunities available at the local, state, and federal level. Since we're limited on time today, I won't go into the details on any of these elements of the plan, but I will drop the link to the Regional Coastal Resilience Plan in the chat so that you can explore it on your own. And with that, I welcome if we have any time for questions, but I'm excited to talk with you all more about the experience with the Climate Ready Coast Southern Maine project. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jessica. That was a stellar example. So I think we have a couple minutes for questions, and we are asking that folks please put your questions in the chat. Unfortunately, just because of the volume of people we have with us today, it's not really feasible to be coming off mute and asking questions. So please ask any questions you have via the chat. And we have a couple in here already. The first, if you're comfortable sharing, is there's some curiosity around the overall budget of this project. Asking if you're able to share the cost of the effort, including staff time and consultants, and maybe adding on to that, if you found grant funding to support this project, or if you're aware of other grant funding for similar kinds of efforts.
Yeah, that is that is a fantastic question, and I realized I should have made it really clear that our project lead is Abby Sherwin from the Southern Maine Planning and Development Commission. I was on the project more as a stakeholder engagement specialist. So off of the top of my head, I don't know exactly what the size of the grant was that we received, but I believe it was in the range of $500,000. I can definitely double check while other speakers are talking. I think in addition to the NIFWIF grant, we also had funding that SMPDC was able to leverage from the towns that are members for the commission. So each of the municipalities that are part of SMPDC's service range puts funding into different projects that they will benefit from. So I know that we were able to leverage some of those funds. I think the thing that I will definitely say is from a project team and kind of staff perspective, we absolutely used a lot more time than we initially budgeted for. Particularly the process of understanding how to use the vulnerability assessment in order to inform decision-making. We initially thought that was going to be a pretty quick process, and then it turned into something that was much more time intensive. So I would say if you can build a buffer into your budget, I would really encourage you to do so.
Yeah, really helpful advice. And maybe one more question to wrap us up. We have a question if you could talk a bit more about how you measured adaptive capacity.
Yes, that is also a wonderful question. And to Danny's point about each project kind of defining a vulnerability assessment in a different way, we did not really incorporate adaptive capacity into our assessment process. And I think actually in some of the conversations that we had with Gwen and Danny from the Office of Coastal Management, I think we actually came to realize that we were much more focused on kind of exposure and sensitivity. I think what I would say, though, is that the adaptive capacity component is really coming into play now that we have this regional plan in place, and it's something that we are trying to help address in terms of helping to build capacity for the towns to take this plan, to take the vulnerability assessment, and to actually do things like, write grant proposals and go after funding. So that's something that we as a project team are kind of continuing to provide technical assistance on.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, please join me in a virtual round of applause for Jessica. Thank you so much.
Thank
We're
you.
going to move over now to California and hear from Julia Chase, who's the Program Manager and Chief Resilience Officer with the City of San Diego. And Julia is going to be sharing with us some of the work they've done around vulnerability assessments at the city level or the city scale. Take it away, Julia.
Awesome. Thanks, Katie. Hi, everyone. I'm Julie Chase. I'm the Chief Resilience Officer with the City of San Diego. Just to start, a little context about San Diego. If you're not familiar with us, we are the second largest city in California and the 8th largest in the US with about 1.4 million residents. We are a border city with the world's busiest land border crossing and have a very diverse population with over 100 languages spoken. We are lucky to have 17 miles of coastline that draw over 35 million visitors every year to our city, and we are also the most biodiverse county in the US. So some of these played into our vulnerability assessment, particularly when we're thinking about our coast. It's a really important feature of the city, both for our community, but also for the tourism industry. The city has multiple climate plans. We're really leading in climate with our climate action plan, setting an ambitious goal of net zero by 2035, and our climate resilient SD plan focusing on investing in and improving the lives of the people that live in the city while increasing our local capacity to prepare for, adapt to, recover from, and thrive in a changing climate. To help support the implementation of our climate action plan, we have a climate action implementation plan that really details out what are the steps, what are the resources that the city is going to need to move these strategies forward. We also have a climate equity index that I'll speak a little bit more to that looks at what areas of our city are most vulnerable to climate change and have the least access to opportunity. And then woven throughout our general plan, we have climate policies that align with and support both our resilience and our mitigation efforts. Before we kind of embarked on our vulnerability assessments, we really started with the end in mind. So what did we need to understand better? Where were we looking to go with our climate adaptation planning efforts? We really wanted to make sure that we were getting a better understanding of where the city was vulnerable, that we were prioritizing areas of vulnerability so that we could really focus in on those as we built out climate resilient SD, so that we knew what were we going to be tailoring those adaptation strategies for. We wanted to kind of be able to create this toolbox to support implementation and have really informed pathways of adaptation and resilience action. So our vulnerability assessment work was done over a course of about 3 years. We started with our sea level rise vulnerability assessments. Those were completed in October of 2019. And then we folded in the findings of our sea level rise vulnerability assessments into our citywide climate hazards vulnerability assessments. That was a multi-hazard vulnerability assessment. So some of the things that we kind of thought about as we were getting the project set up and scoping for what this work was going to look like was just reviewing where were we seeing historic impacts across the city, where had we seen wildfires before, where had we seen flooding, really getting an understanding of what were those historic impacts, what was kind of that baseline, reviewing any existing data and reports with regards to potential vulnerability of our city assets and our communities. And then identifying too where there were potential gaps, where did we need to know more? One of the things that we found out during this was that we really needed to update our coastal erosion assessment, that hadn't been updated in quite a few years. And so we were able to fold that into our project scope. The next was to identify what were those primary climate hazards that we wanted to be looking at. So this is going to be, location specific. We're not too worried about blizzards in San Diego, but we are concerned with things like sea level rise and wildfires. From there, we looked at what were those relevant climate projections, what were the future scenarios that we were going to be using for our vulnerability assessment, and then determining what were those critical assets and who was the project team that we needed to bring in for this work. So really trying to understand, what do we know, what don't we know, what do we need to know, and who needs to be involved in this process. So the criteria for our critical assets, this was a really important step in our vulnerability assessment because the city has quite a few assets, and we really wanted to narrow in on what were those critical assets, what do we need to be focusing on if we are resource limited, where is it best for us to be focusing those resources. So these were our 4 criteria: if the asset or resource or its function was necessary for the continuity of important city operations. This could be things like our water system, being able to make sure that we are providing clean water to all of our community members and residents. The next was if the asset or resource was a key driver in the city's economy. This is important because it allows the city to continue to function. The third was whether or not the loss of the asset or resource would present equity concerns. Social equity is a really important priority for all of our climate action, for all of the city's actions. And so we wanted to make sure that that was one of our prioritization factors for what was going to be included within the vulnerability assessment. And then finally, if the asset or resource was critical to safeguarding biological diversity or other environmental priorities. Again, just recognizing here we are a biodiversity hotspot, that we do have certain priorities for protected species, and we wanted to make sure again that that was a priority that was kind of rising to the top at the beginning of scoping our vulnerability assessment. So where that brought us was to a list of 30 different asset types within the public safety, water infrastructure, transportation, stormwater, open space and environment, and then kind of additional assets for our sectors. This both really helped to define the scope of our vulnerability assessment, but also define who were those key partners across our city. So what city departments did we need to be working with? What city departments did we need to make sure we had buy-in, that they understood what we were doing, and that they could be engaged in the process as we moved through the vulnerability assessment. This step is also really crucial, I think, to beginning to get those wheels turning for asset managers if they haven't thought about how climate change is going to impact their assets and their operations, to start having those conversations and start to get them thinking about what might it mean for their operations in the future. So for the city of San Diego, as I mentioned, we did a multi-hazard vulnerability assessment. Our 4 primary hazards for us are extreme heat, wildfire, precipitation-driven flooding, and sea level rise. So that, again, really helped define the scope of what were we looking at with our vulnerability assessment. There were some other climate hazards that we considered, or we kind of put in the secondary hazard category, either due to it not being a priority based off of the assets that we were including, if it was being focused on by another city department. So drought is something that we also face within the city of San Diego, but with regards to our water supply, that is largely led by another department, and we already had vulnerability assessments that were specifically looking at that, so we didn't need to duplicate that effort in our vulnerability assessment. Here's some terms again. Danny went through these, but we really used this step in determining what was the vulnerability of our assets. With regards to risk, similar to what Danny mentioned, we didn't really look at likelihood. Likelihood was kind of akin to whether or not the asset was exposed or not. We didn't look further into that likelihood factor, but we did look at consequences with what would happen if that asset was exposed. What are some of those potential kind of downstream outcomes to either the asset user or the city? This vulnerability scoring was done in consultation with all of our city departments. So we would kind of go through and do an initial score of what assets were exposed. And then based off of best practices, based off of the literature, what do we think the sensitivity and the adaptive capacity of those assets were? And then we went back to our city departments and we had one-on-ones with all of the asset managers to say, is this correct? Should we change things? Should we update things? Does your asset have more adaptive capacity that maybe we're not aware of? Maybe, the pump station can be elevated and we didn't think that it could, or the area could be sealed off more. So really understanding from the people who are day in, day out dealing with these assets, are we getting this right when it comes to sensitivity and adaptive capacity, so that score is really informed by city operations. With regards to exposure, I do want to talk a little bit about this. So for our exposure, we mostly relied on the California Fourth Climate Change Assessment reports, as well as associated data that's available on CalAdapt in California. That's our climate data clearinghouse. It's a primary source of information when it comes to climate change scenarios, climate impact, various tools that you can use. So we really look to use that to make sure that we were being consistent with efforts from the state, with other cities across the state, that we're kind of using the standard for climate information. For sea level rise in particular, we use Cosmos, which is the Coastal Storm Modeling System. This is an interactive tool that allows you to model sea level rise, storm surge, groundwater intrusion in California. And we used this tool alongside state guidance from the Ocean Protection Council and the California Coastal Commission to determine what were you using for our sea level rise projections, and then what did that look like when we were doing that exposure mapping. So all of that brought us to our vulnerability assessment findings, where across the different sectors and asset types, we were able to really focus in on what were those medium and high vulnerabilities across all of the different hazards. So the dots here are color coded by hazard. This is just a kind of quick snapshot that again allows us to focus in for our adaptation resilience plan. Where do we need to be making sure that we are developing strategies to address these vulnerabilities? So here, some kind of key takeaways. Wildfire is something that a lot of our assets are highly vulnerable to. Our open space and environment assets are typically highly vulnerable to a lot of these hazards, in particular sea level rise and storm surge, as well as our historic and tribal cultural resources. Those assets are highly vulnerable to almost all of our climate hazards. Then for our consequence screenings, again, this was done in partnership with our city departments, having those one-on-one discussions with them to understand what were going to be those potential outcomes if an asset was exposed to these various hazards. What were we going to see in terms of damage or disruption or failure of the assets? How would that interfere with city operations? Other types of impacts, whether that's public health and safety, cultural resources, natural resources, or our communities of concern, our vulnerable communities. The consequences screenings, I thought, were incredibly valuable as well when, again, we're developing those adaptation strategies, because you're able to kind of see like, okay, if this is going to have a public health impact, what are those different strategies that we could develop that are going to minimize that impact to public health and safety? So as mentioned, social equity, climate equity is incredibly important to the city as we are developing and implementing our climate plans. We define this as prioritizing our communities of concern to ensure that investments and resources are prioritized for those with the greatest needs and the greatest vulnerabilities. In order to do this, we really leverage our climate equity index. This was developed in 2019 alongside a climate equity working group made up of over 20 different community-based organizations that serve our more vulnerable communities. And it measures what we call level of access to opportunity. That's scored based off of 41 different indicators. So that includes things such as tree coverage, proximity to waste sites, healthy food access, housing cost burden, flood risk, pedestrian access, those types of things, and really allows us to understand where are those communities that are going to see a disproportionate impact. The Climate Equity Index really allows us to help to identify those vulnerable populations, to weave it into our vulnerability assessment, and to weave it into our adaptation planning and implementation efforts. So for climate equity, as mentioned, we use the CEI to screen for disproportionate impacts and to inform strategy development and prioritization. So this might look like things of, when we're looking at city buildings that are potentially impacted by flooding or heat, a recreation center or a library that also functions as a cool zone within one of our disadvantaged communities may have a disproportionate impact on those communities should that building be impacted. So that one would then screen higher for that social equity component. Throughout our vulnerability assessment, there was significant stakeholder and community engagement. Although our vulnerability assessment, I would say, kind of lends a little bit more on the kind of technical side, we really did see it as an opportunity to bring in the community to understand where their concerns were, but also to raise awareness and again begin that conversation around climate change impacts, to go out into the community, to let them know that what we were doing, and to hear from them. Alongside that, I would say we really recognized that the vulnerability assessment was quite a long and technical document, and that most people might not have the time or maybe the desire to read the entirety of the document, but we did really want the findings to be something that was accessible and that someone could kind of take quickly and understand all of the work that we had done. So we created both a brochure and a postcard that was kind of just a snapshot overview of what were we doing, why were we undertaking the vulnerability assessment, what were those hazards that we were looking at, and then what were the key outcomes or the key findings, so that if someone just had a few minutes but they wanted to understand more about this work, that they were able to do that. And it's quite an easy read too. We really removed any of that technical language. We also had a significant internal coordination with our city departments. They were really crucial in informing the findings of the vulnerability assessment. And then we also brought together a stakeholder advisory group. This was a technical working group to review and validate our approach, our findings, as well as any interconnection across jurisdictions or across connecting assets. Our stakeholder advisory group was made up of our internal city departments alongside state and federal agencies, environmental organizations, community-based organizations, transportation agencies, energy utilities, and academic institutions. So really making sure that we're kind of bringing all of those voices together throughout the process. This group was also maintained throughout our planning efforts for our climate adaptation and resilience plan. This is just a kind of an overview of how we funded this. Funding, I know, is always something it's important, and it's sometimes a limiting factor. So for our vulnerability assessment, we had two that were sea level rise vulnerability assessments. These were funded by a California Coastal Commission local coastal program grant. And then we had a citywide climate change vulnerability assessment that was funded by a Caltrans SB1 adaptation planning grant program. Our climate resilient San Diego plan itself was completed in-house, and now our coastal resilience master plan, which is looking to address some of those vulnerabilities that we identified within our vulnerability assessments, is funded both by a NIFWIF and a state coastal conservancy grant. And happy to answer any questions about this. Some additional considerations as you're moving through the vulnerability assessment, check if you have any legislative requirements. These might also be drivers that might help push your vulnerability assessment forward. So for us, there's the AB 691 in California. This requires grantees of public trust lands to assess the impacts of sea level rise. There's also SB 379 and SB 1035 that require cities and counties to complete a vulnerability assessment, also to develop a set of goals, policies, and objectives to address those vulnerabilities. We did that through our climate resilient SD plan. So we incorporated into our general plan our vulnerability assessment as well as our adaptation strategies. And then as well, just be mindful of state guidance. It can be really helpful as you're kind of thinking through what does your vulnerability assessment look like? What are those projections that you're doing? How to think about maybe risk tolerance. So for us, again, that's the Ocean Protection Council and the California Coastal Commission's sea level rise guidance. And then quickly, because I think I might be running out of time here, a few additional considerations. think about it as a living document if you can, and write that in to either your vulnerability assessment or your adaptation plan so that you're able to use updated science as the science is updated. It takes often quite a bit of time to update plans. And so if you're able just to use the latest state guidance or the latest federal guidance when it comes to sea level rise and make sure that you're pointing to that, it allows your document to be a little bit more of a living document. And then also, think about, where you might need more local or downscaled data to inform this. As we move through our vulnerability assessment, we identified the need for, in particular, more downscaled data when it came to heat to inform our heat adaptation strategies. And so that was kind of a helpful outcome of it helps inform future efforts where we needed to gather a little bit more precise data. And that's it. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Julia. And in the interest of time, we are going to have to move on to our next regional case study, but I encourage folks to enter their questions in the chat, and Julia can respond to you directly via the chat. I already see one in here from Farah, if you're able to find that one in the queue. And I will pass it over to a colleague from my neck of the ocean, Ruby Papp, who's the Coastal Land Use Extension Specialist with Hawaii Sea Grant, is going to be sharing with us the process for the West Kauai Community Vulnerability Assessments. I'll pass it to you, Ruby.
Mahalo. Can everyone see the appropriate screen?
We do see your presenter view.
Oh, okay. We'll do that again. How's that?
Looks better. You're good.
Okay. Aloha mai kako. I'm Ruby Papp, as Katie just said. I'm an extension agent with UHC Grant, and I work very closely with the County of Kauai Planning Department. And this project is a community-based vulnerability assessment that we conducted between 2018 and 2020 in partnership with the UH Department of Urban and Regional Planning and the county. And the lead author is Danielle Spirandelli, with co-authors Alicia Summers and Aaron Brake. So the county has a policy in its 2018 general plan to conduct hazard risk and vulnerability assessments for climate change and sea level rise. And so this was our first attempt to do a vulnerability assessment on the island, and perhaps in the state specific to sea level rise, but I can't be sure about that. And the attempt was really to integrate Western science, so the exposure mapping that had just been published by the state with local knowledge. And the impetus for conducting this assessment in West Kauai was the fact that the county was about to update the West Kauai Community Plan. So that was an important time to incorporate some climate vulnerability considerations. And so these community plans, for those of you who aren't familiar, they just sort of represent the vision and plan for how the area will be developed or conserved, and how the area will, and it'll lead to things like land use policies and zoning. So just a little bit about West Kauai. The West Kauai Planning District is actually a modern government construction, but it's comprised in Native Hawaiian terms of the Kona Moku of Kauai, and comprised of three what they call ahupua'a, which are generally the watershed boundaries of Waimea, Makaweli, and Hanapepe. It's characterized by its beautiful environment, natural resources. It also has a very rich historical presence of the sugar plantation, as well as a diverse, closely knit community that deeply values and continues to practice Native Hawaiian traditions, but also has a large settler community from Asia that came to work on the plantations, Asia and elsewhere. So many of the families were born and raised here, and there were also many are of lower income status, and with many generations living on the same property And, you know, like everywhere else, well, Hawaii, I would say, has a major housing crisis. So average household spends about 60% or more of their income on housing and transportation. And so that just really feeds into the mix when you're thinking about vulnerability. So what did we do? In terms of who participated in the community vulnerability assessment, we wanted to get the word out to as many people as possible, but we didn't have a huge budget. I didn't mention in the beginning, the budget was $141,000 for 2 years. And then we had 2 graduate assistants provided by the university. So this was funded by University of Hawaii Sea Grant College program. So our main focus was getting as much community out as possible, but they were mainly self-selecting through word of mouth. But we really worked hard to get our asset managers from the county and the community and community leaders side by side with community members. For the first phase of the project, we conducted 30 in-depth interviews with asset managers and community leaders to help identify the main sea level rise management concerns for West Kauai. And then we held a really fun event to kick off the project at the local movie theater, where we showed a sea level rise film called Miss South Pacific. The attendees then saw a presentation about the project and learned about sea level rise, and then kind of voted and validated these management concerns that were brought up by our interview process, which took a few months. So that was just the first phase. And then, so the second phase, I can't even believe we did this, but we did 8 4-hour workshops with the community on each management concern. And these were very in-depth. We had food, we had lots of breaks. People got to know each other. And so we used this decision support tool, which I'm going to talk about, called VCAPS. And I'm going to tell you what that acronym is in a minute. But we really focused on getting the subject matter experts and the asset managers sitting with the community. So to incorporate exposure data with local knowledge, and to talk about each of these systems in depth. And we used, in order to get the word out, we really relied on one community group that was active and doing their own hazards work to help. It was a neighborhood association, the Hanapepe Ele'ale Neighborhood Association, got the word out to their community. And we also used the email list for the West Kauai Community Plan. We put out flyers, and we slowly built up an email list. So these are the management concerns that were identified in the first phase with the interviews, and then the group event, the film event. And we held meetings specific to these topics throughout the remainder of the first year and second year as well. And so again, we were using this, we had in mind this definition of vulnerability, but also understanding there's a lot of different ways to talk about sensitivity and adaptive capacity. Ours was much more qualitative through conversation and group learning. And so to start off with exposure, we relied on the great data set from the state of Hawaii for sea level rise. So the Hawaii Sea Level Rise Viewer .org, if you want to look at that. But we have exposure data for up to several scenarios, up to 3.2 feet of sea level rise. And the hazard impacts that are included are coastal erosion, passive flooding, and annual high wave flooding. And so we were able to, with our grad students' help, create a series of maps for the community to use. So they had a baseline of, okay, what is the data telling us in terms of exposure? In this case, this was for our, I'm not going to be able to show you all of them, but this was for our drainage discussion. Drainage and levees was a big concern by the community. So this is a map showing all the ditches and the drainage ways and the exposure data. So we use this at our meetings. And again, a lot of times I will see and vulnerability assessments kind of stop here with the exposure, but we wanted to go further with community knowledge to kind of get at that sensitivity and adaptive capacity. So how we decided to do that is we used this VCAPS decision support tool, and stands for Vulnerability and Consequences Adaptation Planning Scenarios Process. Quite a mouthful, but it was developed by several different Sea Grant programs in North Carolina and South Carolina, as well as CISA in the University of Southern California, and SERI, which I can't remember what the acronym is, but you can Google them. They still have, maybe they've updated their software. It's a free open source software that you can use to basically document a conversation with the community, because we all know when you start talking to folks at meetings, the issues can become very overwhelming. And so how do you kind of organize that into a map essentially that shows the different aspects of vulnerability? So here's just an example. So we basically used the whole manual for VCAPS for our entire vulnerability assessment, even from phase 1, from identifying the management concerns. So you see on the left here, you start with a management concern. You talk to the community about what hazard or stressor they're most concerned about. In this case, it was mostly sea level rise. And then the conversation flows to outcomes and consequences. And all of this stuff is mapped live during a facilitated meeting. So we had a designated facilitator, which was myself. And then we had like a climate expert in each meeting that did a presentation on climate change and sea level rise and the data. And then you can fill out the diagram with contextual factors, and that usually leads to suggested public actions or private actions that can be taken to address the outcomes or consequences. So here's just an example of a very simplified version that we did for transportation. And then here's a much more complex diagram that we did at our meeting for the drainage and levees. And at the very beginning of the meeting, the community identified several concerns of several climate stressors, as you can see, but they eventually decided to focus on sea level rise plus heavy rainfall and what that would mean for the drainage system. So the scenario building helps to parse out the outcomes and address each hazard outcome individually, and allows for a richer conversation about potential solutions. And we felt that this was also a good way to really talk about adaptation or adaptive capacity and such through the contextual factors discussion and the consequences discussions. But it was much more of a qualitative process that we opted to do. And again, you need somebody like a grad student or someone who's very familiar with using this type of diagramming quickly on the fly to do this. And our grad students did a wonderful job on this as I facilitated. And again, you have a climate expert that does a presentation in the beginning. Rather than going on to kind of the results, since this presentation is much more based on process, I'll just move on. And I'll give you links to the report if you want to look at kind of what we figured out with all of this. So again, we did this type of mapping, this VCAPS mapping for all of the management concerns. So we had about 8 meetings. I think our transportation meeting ended up going into 2 meetings because we were just getting used to the process. And at the end of the day, we were able to put all of the vulnerability information into a report, and that then informed the West Kauai Community Plan process, which was a whole separate process from the vulnerability assessment. So again, this was an attempt to integrate, you know, the exposure data with local community knowledge about the assets and then just areas of their community that they were concerned about. But we wanted to know whether this could be done again, especially at a county-wide scale. So luckily, we did an evaluation of this process. Alicia Summers, one of our graduate students, conducted this evaluation. And she did a quantitative survey as well as qualitative interviews with the participants. And I don't really have time to get into all of it. It was very, very thorough, but we learned a lot in many areas for improvement, but many areas were validated as well. So one of the key questions was, what was the overall participants' attitudes towards the process? And overall, they were satisfied. They loved the collaborative nature of the workshops, but they also said it wasn't inclusive. We had about 30 regulars show up at our meetings, and they were awesome. They were all from the community, and our asset managers attended as well. But we were very kind of limited in reaching out to all communities, such as the Native Hawaiian community, to integrate their cultural science and ancestral Hawaiian knowledge. And again, as I said in the beginning, we just didn't have the budget for doing that extensive outreach, but now this is ongoing, so it hasn't stopped here. The take home for that is with certain populations, especially Indigenous populations, going to where they're at and meeting with them is a much better way to go than having them come to these long meetings. Probably the same case for a lot of other folks as well. Another question was, what was about the VCAPS modeling tool? How did they feel about participating in that? Because it was a very tedious process, and they felt that VCAPS was extremely important for helping to garner detailed knowledge of the climate risks and potential adaptation actions. And it also promoted transparency because it was all mapped in front of everybody, and the maps were then used to create the report. But it's also, the modeling process could feel very intimidating and overwhelming, which may have limited participation. And then how did workshop participants, which included county planners and other agencies, perceive using this and replicating this community-based process for other vulnerability assessments in Hawaii? And they did agree that vulnerability assessments must meaningfully engage the community, but that we would have to figure out some way of shortening the length of time for the overall process to make this more integrated into our modern governmental processes. And that this would be more preferable to have a third party like Sea Grant or another boundary organization or consultant to lead this type of assessment. And then how did it actually work to inform the West Kauai Community Plan? And the answer was yes, it did in some ways. Again, this was just a vulnerability assessment. So the next step would be to do more of an adaptation plan to really get specifics, but the community plan did incorporate many of the findings. And there was a couple key pieces of legislation that came out of this, including a special overlay called the Special Treatment Coastal Edge and a sea level rise constraint district for building island-wide. So we did find that it did inform that, and that the CVA is continuing to inform West Side community planning projects. And so I think I will stop there. However, I did want to note one last thing, was that we haven't stopped with that. That was our first attempt, and the county then took the success of the project, and they're doing an island-wide adaptation plan now. And they were able to incorporate some of the results of the evaluation. So to really expand the community engagement island-wide through all these types of venues, through surveys, a youth climate summit, specific talk story, what we call talk stories, or one-on-one interviews with different populations that wouldn't generally attend something like this. And they also did a more in-depth quantitative equity analysis using social vulnerability index. And the consultant, they have a consultant for this island-wide project, which is Ramey and Associates. So I just wanted to stop there and see if there are questions. Mahalo.
Thank you so much, Ruby. And again, unfortunately, because we're coming up on the end of our time together, I think we're going to have to keep our questions in the chat, but please feel free to add your questions in the chat and Ruby can respond to those directly. And I'm going to pass it back over to Lauren.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you all of the speakers. Those were great snapshots of the work that you've been conducting in your regions. We will bring on Jake Thickman, a senior resilience specialist from NOAA's Office for Coastal Management, to share some of insights that he has on what to think about when scoping a vulnerability to ensure it meets your needs.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. You guys see my screen okay or no?
We see it.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think the speakers did a great job. A lot of interesting information there. And so what I'm just going to try to do with a few summary slides is maybe take some commonalities and show like a high-level framework that you might be able to use when thinking about what questions to think about when scoping a vulnerability assessment or even maybe a larger adaptation planning effort. So maybe as an overall component, one of the things that we talk about is starting with these 5 W's to frame your overall effort. We definitely saw this, I think, in each case study that was presented today, thinking about who needs to be involved, whether it's your planning team, certain members from public works departments, community members, why you're undertaking this type of planning effort, whether it's a vulnerability assessment or going on to an adaptation plan, where spatial boundaries are about that effort. It's also helpful to think of, because these are climate projections, maybe setting a time horizon in the future that you're going to plan for. And maybe the most important part, really being specific about the outcomes and the outputs that you want to see out of a vulnerability assessment or an overall planning effort, whether that you saw some alignment with other concurrent planning efforts a lot, and I think in each of these case studies. So making sure that what you're producing fits in to kind of where you want to go. And thank you to Julia, who I think said these exact words, starting with the end used in mind. I think can really help to focus thinking about what specifically you want to get out of a vulnerability assessment. And there can be a lot of different uses. And it doesn't have to be just one. It could be a tool to identify impacts, using that same information to inform future actions to build onto an adaptation plan, outreach or communication resource, not just the technical information, but to inform community members. If there's any planning requirements, I think the California specific requirements were mentioned, so do certain needs to be met, or yeah, do certain needs to be met there. And then funding opportunities. So if you think about that ahead of time, and maybe even tailor your assessment to really go for those funding opportunities, that can be very useful in how you scope an assessment. And then getting into maybe if you're trying to dig into what questions for your specific project. And again, I think we saw this across each case study, thinking about what data you need to do that assessment, whether that is specific hazard data, what types of hazards you want to look at, and also what is available. What public data sets can you leverage? What already exists? If there's any universities that are publishing data around where you're working. Each one of those things you can bring in really helps save and make your budget go as far as possible. And again, yeah, so leading into budget, often maybe the biggest constraint on what level of assessment or how much you can really dig into certain spots, but just being mindful of that and also being mindful of it in light of community engagement efforts and how much time those might require. And along with that, what technical expertise do you have available? That could be within your organization, whether that's your specific planning team or public works departments, other city staff members, regional staff members. But it also includes things like place-based community knowledge, indigenous knowledge, again, maybe local universities, or if there really is a gap, something that you might have to fill with a consultant. But just thinking about what expertise is available can help you, if you are going to bring on a consultant, refine exactly what you need from them and how that fits in with other expertise that you're going to leverage. One of the findings needed, the timeline, just being aware of any, if there's any hard cutoffs for whatever reason for your assessment, or if certain outputs from certain steps are needed to inform next steps, keeping those in mind, especially when thinking about developing new data that could add a significant amount of time. So just keeping that in mind when you're scoping. And then maybe the biggest one is, what types of outputs do you need? So we heard about qualitative data being equally useful in some cases as highly specific quantitative data. And I think this really goes to what you are trying to use the assessment to inform. And if you need to go for some assessments, you might need to know, is this piece of stormwater infrastructure, what's the level of flooding, or the flood depth, the flood duration with 3 feet of sea level rise on a monthly basis. You might need to get that specific. For other types of assessments, maybe more on the planning side or getting into adaptation concepts, it might simply be, what are the rough limits of the annual flood event in this area? You don't need to maybe tease out all those extra modeling components. Just thinking about that, I know I'm running up against the end of time, but another kind of discussion question we wanted to pose were, as you listen to the case studies today, and maybe, I gave a little quick summary of the questions we might suggest that you consider. Are there any other key questions that either you have considered when approaching a vulnerability assessment, or considering this sort of information that you think should be considered as part of a vulnerability assessment? And with that, I will hand it back over for a quick wrap up, and we're running against the end of time.
Thank you, Jake, and thank you, everybody. So we are at our time limit today, so I think we're going to have to move into our wrap-up slides. If go to the next, please. We're going to go ahead and skip this discussion and just go ahead and wrap up and say thank you all so much for coming. We really encourage folks to visit our website and sign up for our listserv. If these are discussions you're interested in continuing, you can find a listserv link in the chat. And we'll be sending out via email an evaluation of this webinar. So we ask you to please provide us some continued input so we can continue to improve these moving forward. And we're also going to have a vulnerability assessment resource document where we've put together some of the information and resources we've collected about vulnerability assessments, and we'll have some opportunity for folks to provide additional resources and weigh in on that as well. So thank you so much for spending time with us today, and please do feel free to join our listserv, stay engaged, and we hope to see you on another webinar in the future. Thanks so much. Oh, and thank you so much to all of our speakers. You were amazing, and we so appreciate your time.